Welcome back to The Sleep Detective, where we dive deep into the darkest corners of criminal psychology. I'm your host, and tonight we're exploring one of the most methodical and terrifying serial killers in American history. Israel Keyes was different from every serial killer we've studied. He didn't hunt in his hometown. He didn't leave signatures. He didn't follow patterns. For over a decade, he buried kill kits across the country, waiting years before returning to use them. He was the first truly modern serial killer, designed for our connected world. Before we begin, I want you to predict something. Based on what you know about serial killers, comment below. What do you think was the most chilling aspect of Israel Keyes' psychology? Was it his planning, his patience, or something else entirely? Let me know your thoughts. If you're fascinated by criminal psychology and want to understand the minds behind these cases, subscribe now for weekly deep dives into the psychology of America's most dangerous killers. You're looking at a photograph of a young boy from rural Washington state. Dark hair, intense eyes, 10 years old. What you're seeing isn't just a child. You're seeing the early formation of one of America's most calculated killers. Israel Keyes was born January 7, 1978, in Richmond, Utah, but his family moved constantly during his early years. By age 10, they'd settled in rural Colville, Washington. This constant movement would shape his psychological development in ways no one could predict. Imagine being a child who never had a hometown, never had childhood friends who lasted more than a year, never had the psychological anchor of a stable community. This creates something psychologists call detachment disorder, but in Israel's case, it created something far more dangerous. His father, John Jeffrey Keyes, was a strict Mormon fundamentalist. Picture a household where every aspect of life was controlled, where questioning authority meant punishment, where independent thought was discouraged. This level of control would teach Israel something crucial about human psychology. The family lived in a cabin without electricity or running water. They hunted for food. They avoided modern conveniences. But this wasn't just about lifestyle. This was about creating psychological distance from mainstream society. And for a developing mind like Israel's, this distance would become deadly. As a psychological profiler, you'd notice something important about Israel's early years. He adapted to each new environment quickly, too quickly. Most children struggle with constant relocation. Israel thrived. He was learning to compartmentalize his identity based on his surroundings. His mother, Heidi Keyes, was deeply religious but emotionally distant. Imagine a child seeking maternal connection and finding only conditional approval based on religious compliance. This creates what psychologists call earned security. Love becomes something you have to work for, not something you naturally receive. The family practiced a form of Mormonism that emphasized isolation from the outside world. They didn't watch television. They didn't read newspapers. They didn't engage with popular culture. For most children, this would create social anxiety. For Israel, it created something different. It created curiosity about the forbidden world. By age 12, Israel had begun to question the religious teachings that dominated his household. But unlike typical adolescent rebellion, his questioning was methodical, calculated. He didn't argue with his parents. He simply began to study what they'd forbidden him to learn about. Picture a 12-year-old boy sneaking away to read about the outside world. Most children would be curious about sports or entertainment. Israel was drawn to darker subjects. He found books about crime, about violence, about human psychology in extreme situations. The psychological foundation being built here is crucial to understand. Israel wasn't developing empathy through normal social interaction. He was developing analytical skills through isolation. He was learning to study human behavior from the outside, like a scientist observing specimens. His father taught him to hunt at an early age. Most children learn hunting as a sport or survival skill. For Israel, hunting became his first introduction to the psychology of predation. The patience required, the planning, the moment of kill. These lessons would evolve into something far more sinister. The constant family relocations taught Israel that identity was fluid, that you could be one person in one place and someone completely different in another. This psychological flexibility would become his greatest weapon as an adult killer. By age 14, Israel had begun to lie habitually to his parents, not about typical teenage things, about his thoughts, about his interests, about his plans. He was learning to create false personas, and he was getting very good at it. The psychological profile emerging here is of a child who learned early that survival meant adaptation, that showing your true self was dangerous, that other people were obstacles to be managed rather than connections to be cherished. His religious upbringing taught him about sin and punishment, but instead of developing moral restraint, Israel began to view morality as a game with rules that could be learned and manipulated. Right and wrong became tactical decisions rather than ethical principles. You need to understand something about high-intelligence children raised in strict religious environments. They often develop what psychologists call cognitive compartmentalization. They learn to separate their analytical mind from their emotional responses. Israel mastered this at an unusually young age. The isolation of rural Washington meant Israel had limited exposure to law enforcement. He didn't grow up seeing police as authority figures to be respected or feared. Instead, he viewed them as puzzle pieces in a game he was learning to play. His early fascination with crime wasn't about glorifying violence. It was about understanding systems, how investigations worked, how evidence was collected, how killers got caught. He was reverse engineering the psychology of criminal investigation before he'd even committed his first crime. The psychological foundation being established here is of a mind that processed human interaction as a series of problems to be solved. Other people weren't individuals with feelings. They were variables in equations that Israel was learning to calculate. By age 16, Israel had begun to experiment with petty theft, not because he needed money, but because he wanted to test his theories about human psychology. He was studying how people responded to violation of their trust. The most chilling aspect of Israel's psychological development was his patience. Most adolescents are impulsive. Israel was learning to delay gratification for years. He was developing the psychological capacity to plan far into the future. His parents' emphasis on self-reliance taught Israel that he couldn't depend on anyone else. But instead of creating healthy independence, this created profound isolation. He was learning to exist completely within his own psychological reality. The religious concept of predestination fascinated Israel. The idea that some people were chosen for salvation while others were destined for damnation. In his developing mind, this evolved into a belief that some people were meant to be predators, while others were natural prey. You're witnessing the formation of a psychological profile that would terrorize the country for over a decade. A mind that learned early to separate completely from human connection. A mind that viewed other people as objects to be manipulated rather than individuals to be respected. The foundation laid in these early years would support one of the most methodical killing sprees in American history. Israel Keyes wasn't born a killer. He was psychologically constructed into one through isolation, religious extremism, and the dangerous combination of high intelligence with complete emotional detachment. By age 18, Israel had developed all the psychological tools he would need to become America's most calculated serial killer. The foundation was complete. The construction of a monster was about to begin. What happened next would prove that the most dangerous killers aren't born. They're built, one psychological brick at a time. And Israel Keyes had just finished building his foundation. The boy in that photograph was gone. In his place stood something far more dangerous. A mind capable of planning murders years in advance. A psychology perfectly designed for the modern world of surveillance and digital tracking. You're watching an 18-year-old Israel Keyes leave his family's rural compound for the first time. He's joined the army, but this isn't about serving his country. This is about learning skills that will make him a more effective killer. The military would teach Israel discipline that his religious upbringing couldn't provide. Army training gave him access to weapons, combat techniques. Most importantly, it taught him how to function in hierarchical systems while maintaining his inner psychological autonomy. Fort Lewis, Washington became Israel's first laboratory for studying normal human behavior. Surrounded by other soldiers, he learned to mimic social connections. He watched how friendships formed, how trust developed, how people revealed their vulnerabilities. His fellow soldiers saw him as quiet but competent, reliable but distant. They didn't realize they were interacting with someone who was studying them like specimens. Every conversation was data collection. Every friendship was psychological research. The Army taught Israel something crucial about American society: how institutions worked, how authority was structured, how information flowed through systems. He was learning the architecture of the world he planned to hunt in. During his military service, Israel began to develop what would become his signature psychological trait: infinite patience. While other soldiers were eager for action, Israel was content to wait, to watch, to learn. Time meant nothing to him. His military training included survival skills that would prove crucial to his later crimes: how to live off the land, how to remain hidden for extended periods, how to move without being tracked. The Army was inadvertently training one of America's most dangerous killers. But the most important thing the military taught Israel was operational security: how to compartmentalize information, how to maintain multiple identities, how to ensure that different parts of an operation never intersected in ways that could compromise the whole. You need to understand something about Israel's psychological development during this period. He wasn't becoming more violent. He was becoming more systematic, more methodical, more capable of long-term planning. His discharge from the Army in 1998 marked the beginning of his true psychological transformation. For the first time in his life, Israel had complete autonomy. No parents, no drill sergeants, no external authority, just him and his developing fantasies. Israel moved to Neobay, Washington, a remote tribal community. Population 865. He chose this location specifically because it was isolated enough for him to disappear, but connected enough to the outside world for him to plan. In Neobay, Israel began his first serious romantic relationship with a woman named Tammy. But this wasn't love. This was psychological experimentation. He was learning how to maintain a normal facade while nurturing his darker interests. His relationship with Tammy served multiple purposes. It provided him with social camouflage. It gave him insights into female psychology. Most importantly, it taught him how to compartmentalize his true self from his public persona. Israel got a job as a handyman and carpenter. The work was perfect for his psychological needs. It gave him access to people's homes. It taught him about security systems. It showed him how people lived when they thought they were safe. During this period, Israel began what he called his research phase. He would drive for hours, studying potential victims, learning their routines, mapping their vulnerabilities. But he wasn't ready to kill yet. He was still learning. His psychological profile during this period shows someone developing what FBI profilers call compartmentalized psychopathy. He could function normally in social situations while simultaneously planning violent crimes. The birth of his daughter in 2001 created an interesting psychological dynamic. Israel discovered he could feel protective love for his child while maintaining complete emotional detachment from potential victims. This wasn't contradiction. This was evolution. His paternal instincts actually enhanced his predatory abilities. Protecting his daughter meant ensuring he never got caught. This gave him additional motivation to perfect his methodical approach to killing. Israel began to develop elaborate fantasies about his future crimes, but unlike typical serial killers, his fantasies weren't about the violence itself. They were about the planning, the execution, the perfect crime. You're witnessing the formation of a personality that would rewrite the textbook on serial killer psychology. Israel wasn't driven by rage or sexual compulsion. He was driven by the intellectual challenge of committing undetectable crimes. His relationship with Tammy provided him with crucial insights into human trust. He learned how to make people feel safe with him, how to present himself as reliable, how to become someone that victims would willingly approach. During this period, Israel also began studying law enforcement techniques. He read books about criminal investigation. He followed high-profile cases in the media. He was learning how killers got caught so he could avoid their mistakes. The psychological profile emerging here is of someone who approached killing like a professional, preparing for the most important job of his life. Every aspect of his personality was being refined for maximum effectiveness. Israel's patience during this period was extraordinary. He spent nearly a decade developing his methods before committing his first murder. Most killers can't wait that long, but Israel understood that preparation was everything. His work as a handyman gave him insights into home security that would prove crucial later. He learned how locks worked, how alarm systems operated, how people behaved when they thought they were safe in their own homes. The psychological foundation laid in his childhood was now supporting a complex personality capable of extraordinary deception. Israel could be a loving father, a reliable employee, and a methodical killer simultaneously. His ability to compartmentalize reached levels that impressed even FBI profilers. He could help a neighbor with home repairs in the morning and plan their murder in the evening without any psychological conflict. The most chilling aspect of Israel's personality development was his emotional detachment. He didn't hate his future victims. He didn't feel anger toward them. They were simply objects that served his psychological needs. By 2005, Israel had developed all the personality traits he would need to become America's most methodical serial killer: the patient planner, the master manipulator, the invisible predator. His personality was perfectly calibrated for the modern world. He understood technology well enough to avoid digital tracking. He understood psychology well enough to avoid behavioral profiling. He understood systems well enough to avoid institutional detection. The boy from rural Washington was gone. In his place stood a man whose personality was specifically designed for killing. Every trait had been refined, every weakness eliminated, every strength amplified. You're inside Israel Key's mind. In 2001, he's 23 years old. He's got a stable job, a girlfriend, a newborn daughter. To everyone around him, he's building a normal life. But in the privacy of his thoughts, something darker is taking shape. The first dark impulse wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like water slowly coming to boil. Israel had been thinking about killing for years, but now those thoughts were becoming more structured, more detailed, more possible. His fantasies began with control, not sexual control, not emotional control, complete psychological control over another human being. He imagined scenarios where someone's life was entirely in his hands, where he was the only thing standing between them and death. The birth of his daughter created an unexpected psychological trigger. Holding this innocent life made him hyper-aware of human vulnerability, but instead of increasing his protective instincts toward others, it amplified his predatory ones. Israel began to categorize people into two groups, those who mattered and those who didn't. His daughter mattered. Tammy mattered because she was connected to his daughter. Everyone else was potential prey. This wasn't emotional, it was tactical. His work as a handyman provided him with perfect cover for his evolving fantasies. He was invited into people's homes. He saw how they lived, how they secured their houses, how they trusted strangers. Each job was reconnaissance for future possibilities. The psychological shift happening here is crucial to understand. Israel wasn't becoming more violent. He was becoming more systematic about violence. His impulses were being channeled through intelligence rather than emotion. He began to study true crime more intensively. But unlike typical consumers of crime media, Israel was taking notes. He was analyzing what worked and what didn't, what got killers caught and what kept them free. His first dark impulse involved a neighbor in Nia Bay, an elderly woman who lived alone. Israel would walk past her house and imagine scenarios. How he could enter, how he could control the situation, how he could leave without being detected. But he didn't act on these impulses. Not yet. Israel understood that his first crime would be the most dangerous. It would be his introduction to killing. Every detail had to be perfect. The psychological development occurring here is what FBI profilers call fantasy rehearsal. Israel was mentally practicing crimes in elaborate detail. Each fantasy was more sophisticated than the last. His impulses weren't random. They were geographically strategic. Israel began to fantasize about killing far from his home base. He understood that distance would make investigation more difficult. This level of planning was unprecedented in serial killer psychology. The role of his military training became evident in his developing impulses. He thought tactically. He considered escape routes. He planned for contingencies. His dark impulses were being filtered through professional military thinking. Israel's relationship with Tammy provided him with crucial insights into human behavior under stress. He learned how to read micro-expressions, how to detect fear, how to recognize when someone was about to break psychologically. His impulses began to include elaborate scenarios involving psychological torture, not physical torture, mental torture. Israel was fascinated by the idea of making someone understand their complete helplessness before killing them. The patience he'd developed in childhood now served his darker purposes. While other potential killers might act impulsively, Israel was willing to wait years for the perfect opportunity. This made him exponentially more dangerous. His dark impulses included detailed post-crime scenarios, how to dispose of evidence, how to establish alibis, how to behave in the aftermath. Israel was planning complete criminal operations, not just individual murders. The psychological profile emerging here is of someone whose dark impulses were being processed through extraordinary intelligence and planning capability. This wasn't madness. This was methodology. Israel began to test his theories on a smaller scale. He would follow people for short distances. He would observe their routines. He would practice moving without being noticed. These were rehearsals for his future crimes. His impulses became more specific during this period. He began to fantasize about killing strangers, people who had no connection to him, no reason to trust him, no way to link him to their disappearance. The psychological mechanism driving his impulses was what experts call power consolidation. Israel felt most psychologically complete when he imagined having absolute control over another person's life and death. His dark impulses were enhanced by his growing knowledge of law enforcement techniques. The more he learned about how investigations worked, the more confident he became that he could commit undetectable crimes. Israel's impulses began to include elaborate scenarios involving multiple victims, not killing sprees. Sequential murders spread across time and geography. He was planning a career, not individual crimes. The role of his isolation in Niabey became crucial to his psychological development. He had time to nurture his dark impulses without external interference. His fantasies could evolve without interruption. His impulses included detailed studies of victim psychology, how different types of people responded to threats, how fear affected decision-making, how terror could be used as a psychological weapon. Israel began to develop what he called his victim profile, not based on physical characteristics or demographics, based on vulnerability, on isolation, on the likelihood that their disappearance would go unnoticed. His dark impulses were remarkably free of emotion. He didn't fantasize about killing people he hated. He fantasized about killing people who represented interesting challenges. This detachment made him far more dangerous. The psychological evolution occurring here is unprecedented in serial killer research. Israel was developing impulses that were completely divorced from traditional motivations, like rage, sexual compulsion, or revenge. His impulses began to include elaborate timelines. He would fantasize about killing someone, then waiting months or years before killing again. This wasn't about frequency, it was about perfection. The most chilling aspect of Israel's developing impulses was their intellectual nature. He was approaching murder like a graduate student approaches a dissertation, with methodology, patience, and academic rigor. By 2005, Israel's dark impulses had evolved into concrete plans. He was ready to move from fantasy to reality. The psychological transformation was complete. The first murder was approaching. You're standing in Niabey, Washington in 2005. Population 865. The most remote corner of the continental United States. For most people, this isolation would feel suffocating. For Israel Keys, it was the perfect laboratory for developing his killing methodology. The geographic isolation of Niabey created the first environmental trigger that pushed Israel toward action. He was surrounded by potential victims who lived alone, elderly residents, isolated fishermen, people whose disappearance might not be noticed for days or weeks. But the most important environmental trigger wasn't the location itself. It was the psychological freedom that isolation provided. For the first time in his life, Israel was completely autonomous. No military supervisors, no religious parents, no external authority questioning his movements or activities. The Maka tribe's reservation status created unique law enforcement challenges that Israel quickly recognized. Multiple jurisdictions, complex legal boundaries, communication gaps between tribal police, county sheriff, and federal agents. These weren't accidents. They were opportunities. Israel's job as a handyman created constant environmental triggers. Every day, he was invited into people's homes. He saw their security systems, their daily routines, their vulnerabilities. Each job was reconnaissance disguised as legitimate work. The trust that rural communities place in service workers became a crucial environmental trigger. People didn't just hire Israel to fix their problems. They welcomed him into their most private spaces. They left him alone in their homes. They treated him like family. His relationship with Tammy provided him with social camouflage that amplified other environmental triggers. As part of a couple with a young child, Israel appeared settled, harmless, the kind of man that neighbors trusted and law enforcement overlooked. The remoteness of the Pacific Northwest created environmental conditions perfect for Israel's developing methodology. Vast wilderness areas where bodies could disappear forever, limited surveillance, sparse population, natural barriers that complicated investigation. Israel began to recognize patterns in the community that served as environmental triggers. Which residents lived alone, which houses were isolated, which people had limited social connections. He was cataloging opportunities while appearing to be a helpful neighbor. The seasonal nature of the fishing industry created temporal environmental triggers. During certain months, the population fluctuated dramatically. Temporary workers arrived and left. Visitors came and went. The perfect cover for someone to disappear without raising immediate alarm. His growing knowledge of the area's geography became an environmental trigger that pushed him toward action. He knew every logging road, every hidden trail, every abandoned building. The landscape itself was becoming his accomplice. The technological limitations of rural law enforcement in 2005 created environmental triggers that wouldn't exist today. Limited surveillance cameras, basic forensic capabilities, communication systems that didn't interface between agencies. Israel was operating in a law enforcement blind spot. The community's acceptance of transient workers created environmental triggers that Israel began to exploit. Seasonal employees, temporary contractors, people who arrived, worked for a few months, then disappeared. Their departure was expected, not investigated. Israel's access to vehicles through his work created environmental triggers that enabled his methodology. He could legitimately travel throughout the region. He had reasons to be in isolated areas. His presence anywhere could be explained by professional necessity. The cultural dynamics of the reservation created environmental triggers that Israel learned to navigate. Complex social hierarchies, insider versus outsider dynamics, historical tensions with law enforcement. These weren't obstacles. They were advantages for someone who understood how to exploit them. His growing reputation as a reliable handyman created environmental triggers that increased his access to potential victims. People recommended him to friends. They left him keys to their houses. They trusted him with their security codes. His legitimate work was creating criminal opportunities. The isolation of many residents, particularly elderly ones, created environmental triggers that Israel began to study systematically. Who lived alone? Who had limited family contact? Who might not be missed immediately? He was building a victim database disguised as a customer list. The community's informal communication networks created environmental triggers that Israel learned to monitor. Who talked to whom? How information spread? How rumors developed? Understanding these networks helped him predict how investigations would unfold. Israel's military background created environmental triggers within the community. Veterans trusted him. They shared information about security. They invited him into their confidence. His service record was opening doors that would normally remain closed. The economic depression affecting many rural communities created environmental triggers that Israel recognized and exploited. Desperate homeowners who couldn't afford proper security. Elderly residents who deferred maintenance because of cost. Poverty was creating vulnerability. His relationship with local business owners created environmental triggers that expanded his access. They referred customers to him. They vouched for his character. They provided him with legitimate reasons to be in people's homes. His professional network was becoming his hunting ground. The limited mental health resources in the community created environmental triggers that Israel found useful. People with psychological problems often lived in isolation. They had limited social connections. Their erratic behavior meant their disappearance might be attributed to voluntary departure rather than foul play. The geography of the Olympic Peninsula created environmental triggers that enabled Israel's developing methodology. Remote beaches where evidence could disappear with the tide. Dense forests where searches would be nearly impossible. Mountain terrain that created natural barriers to investigation. Israel's growing familiarity with tribal law enforcement created environmental triggers that he began to exploit. Limited resources, jurisdictional complications, cultural sensitivities that affected investigation techniques. He was learning to navigate a complex legal landscape. The community's seasonal rhythms created environmental triggers that Israel began to track. Tourist seasons when strangers were common, winter months when isolation increased, weather patterns that affected travel and communication. He was learning to time his activities to natural cycles. His access to homes during repairs created environmental triggers that revealed security vulnerabilities. Broken locks that weren't fixed, alarm systems that weren't used, hiding places where spare keys were kept. Every job was teaching him how to exploit human carelessness. The trust that his girlfriend Tammy placed in him created environmental triggers that enabled his psychological compartmentalization. She didn't question his absences. She didn't monitor his activities. She provided him with the domestic camouflage he needed while developing his criminal methodology. The community's informal justice system created environmental triggers that Israel learned to navigate. How disputes were resolved, how problems were handled internally, how law enforcement was or wasn't involved. This knowledge helped him understand how his crimes would be processed. Israel's growing collection of tools and equipment created environmental triggers that enabled his fantasies to become more concrete. Professional-grade tools that could serve multiple purposes, vehicles that could transport evidence, storage areas where he could hide materials. His legitimate resources were becoming criminal assets. The psychological isolation that many rural residents experienced created environmental triggers that Israel began to exploit systematically. People who were starved for social contact, who trusted too easily, who were grateful for any attention. Loneliness was creating vulnerability. The limited media coverage of the area created environmental triggers that would benefit Israel's future crimes. Local disappearances didn't receive regional attention. Investigative resources were limited. Public awareness was minimal. He was operating in an information void. His growing understanding of the community's power structures created environmental triggers that he could exploit. Who made decisions? Who influenced opinion? Who controlled resources? This knowledge would help him navigate any future investigation. The environmental triggers were now aligned. The isolated location, the vulnerable population, the limited law enforcement resources, the social trust, the geographic advantages. Everything Israel needed to begin killing was in place. By 2007, the environmental triggers had created the perfect storm for Israel Keys to transition from fantasy to reality. The stage was set. The methodology was developed. The first murder was imminent. The boy who had been shaped by isolation was now using isolation as his weapon. The environment that had created him was about to enable him. The killing was about to begin. You're witnessing the birth of a completely new type of serial killer methodology. Israel Keys is about to revolutionize how predators operate in modern America. What he's developing isn't just a method for killing, it's a system for remaining invisible. The foundation of Israel's methodology was geographic separation. Unlike every serial killer before him, he refused to hunt where he lived. This wasn't instinct. This was calculated strategy based on his study of how other killers were caught. Israel developed what he called kill kits, pre-positioned caches of weapons, tools, and supplies buried in remote locations across the United States. Each kit contained everything needed for abduction, murder, and disposal. This level of advanced preparation was unprecedented. His methodology included extensive reconnaissance trips. Israel would travel to potential hunting grounds months or even years before committing crimes there. He would study the area, map escape routes, identify disposal sites. Then he would leave and let time erase his presence. The psychological aspect of his methodology was equally sophisticated. Israel developed techniques for approaching victims that maximize compliance while minimizing resistance. He studied how fear affected decision-making, how to use psychological pressure to maintain control. His methodology included elaborate deception techniques, false identities backed by legitimate documentation, rental cars paid for with cash, hotel rooms registered under aliases. Israel was creating fictional personas that could commit crimes while his real identity remained clean. The timing component of his methodology was crucial. Israel would travel to crime locations during periods when his absence from home could be explained by legitimate activities, work trips, family visits, vacation time. Every crime was wrapped in plausible alibis. His methodology included victim selection criteria that differed from traditional serial killers. Israel didn't choose victims based on physical type or personal characteristics. He chose them based on vulnerability and isolation, people whose disappearance would complicate investigation. The disposal aspect of his methodology was particularly sophisticated. Israel developed techniques for completely eliminating evidence of his crimes. Bodies were dismembered and scattered across multiple locations. Physical evidence was destroyed using methods that left no forensic traces. His methodology included counter-surveillance techniques learned from his military training. How to detect if he was being followed, how to vary his routes, how to use natural terrain to avoid electronic surveillance. He was operating like a foreign intelligence agent. Israel's communication methodology was designed to prevent digital tracking. He used prepaid phones purchased with cash, internet access from public computers, mail drops, and storage units rented under false identities. His crimes existed in analog spaces that couldn't be digitally traced. His methodology included psychological preparation techniques for maintaining his normal facade after committing crimes, visualization exercises, emotional compartmentalization, behavioral rehearsal. Israel was training himself to return home and act completely normal. The financial aspect of his methodology was carefully planned. Israel used legitimate income to fund his criminal activities. Cash transactions left no paper trails. Multiple bank accounts in different states provided access to funds without creating suspicious patterns. His methodology included seasonal timing that took advantage of weather patterns and tourism cycles. Crimes committed during periods when outdoor activities were common, when transient populations provided cover, when harsh weather would complicate searches. Israel developed transportation methodologies that avoided detection, rental cars from different companies, circuitous routes that avoided toll roads and traffic cameras. vehicle swapping techniques that broke continuity of surveillance. His methodology included detailed documentation techniques, not for trophies or psychological satisfaction, for operational security. Israel kept records of his techniques so he could refine and improve them for future crimes. The most revolutionary aspect of Israel's methodology was his patience. He was willing to wait years between crimes, to let investigations go cold, to allow law enforcement attention to move to other cases. Time was his greatest weapon. His methodology included elaborate testing procedures, small crimes used to verify that his techniques worked, burglaries that tested security systems, thefts that confirmed his ability to operate undetected. Each successful test increased his confidence. Israel developed victim interaction methodologies designed to maximize psychological control, specific phrases that induced compliance, body language that projected authority, voice modulation that conveyed threat without creating panic that might lead to resistance. His methodology included evidence destruction techniques that went far beyond what other killers attempted. Chemical dissolution, high-temperature incineration, scattering across multiple ecosystems. Israel was eliminating not just evidence, but any trace that crimes had occurred. The psychological methodology Israel developed for maintaining his cover identity was extraordinarily sophisticated. He created separate mental compartments for different aspects of his life. His criminal activities existed in psychological isolation from his family relationships. His methodology included law enforcement study techniques that kept him ahead of investigative methods, reading professional journals, following high-profile cases, understanding how forensic science was evolving. Israel was constantly updating his approach. Israel developed victim selection methodologies that prioritized investigative confusion over personal preference, random selections that couldn't be profiled, victims from different demographics and geographic areas, people whose disappearances would be attributed to other causes. His methodology included post-crime analysis techniques that helped him learn from each operation what worked well, what created unnecessary risk, how to improve efficiency. Each crime was a learning opportunity for future ones. The technology methodology Israel developed was designed to exploit the limitations of 2007-era law enforcement capabilities. Cell phone tracking was primitive. Surveillance cameras were sparse. Digital forensics were basic. He was operating in technological blind spots. His methodology included identity protection techniques that kept his real name out of any criminal context, false documentation, disguise techniques, voice alteration. Even if someone saw him, they wouldn't see the real Israel Keys. Israel developed psychological conditioning methodologies that prepared him for the stress of committing crimes, visualization techniques, stress inoculation, mental rehearsal. He was training his mind for murder the way athletes train for competition. His methodology included contingency planning that covered multiple failure scenarios, what to do if confronted by law enforcement, how to abort operations that became too risky, escape routes from any situation. Israel planned for everything. The most chilling aspect of Israel's methodology was its scalability. This wasn't a system for committing individual crimes. It was a framework for a decades-long career of undetected killing. He was building a sustainable murder business. By 2007, Israel had developed the most sophisticated serial killer methodology in American criminal history. Every aspect had been tested. Every vulnerability had been addressed. Every technique had been refined. The methodology was complete. The killing was about to begin. You're inside Israel Key's mind as he watches potential victims. But he's not looking at physical characteristics. He's not drawn to specific demographics. He's analyzing something far more sinister: psychological vulnerability and investigative complexity. Israel's victim selection process was unlike any serial killer in history. He didn't have a type in the traditional sense. No preferred age range, no specific gender, no particular physical characteristics. His selection criteria was purely tactical. The first criterion was isolation. Israel targeted people who lived alone or spent significant time alone, not because they were easier to control, but because their disappearance would be noticed later. Time was always his greatest ally. His second criterion was social connectivity. Israel preferred victims with limited family ties or distant family relationships, people whose absence wouldn't immediately trigger widespread concern, people who might be assumed to have left voluntarily. The third criterion was routine predictability. Israel studied people whose schedules were consistent enough to allow planning, but not so rigid that their absence would be immediately noticed. He needed victims who disappeared during normal activity periods. Israel's victim psychology assessment went deeper than surface behavior. He looked for people carrying emotional burdens, recent divorces, job losses, family problems, people whose disappearance might be attributed to personal crisis rather than criminal activity. He specifically avoided victims who were part of tight-knit communities, no popular social figures, no beloved family members, no people whose disappearance would mobilize large-scale searches. Israel understood that investigation intensity was proportional to victim visibility. His psychological profiling of potential victims included assessment of their likely responses to threats. People who seemed compliant under pressure, people who showed submissive body language, people who appeared to avoid confrontation in normal social situations. Israel studied victim psychology through his handyman work. He observed how different people reacted to strangers in their homes, who was trusting, who was suspicious, who asked questions, who simply accepted his presence without scrutiny. The most chilling aspect of his victim selection was its randomness within his tactical parameters. Once he identified someone who met his criteria, their fate was sealed. There was no personal animosity, no psychological trigger, just cold calculation. Israel's victim approach psychology was designed to maximize compliance through confusion rather than terror. He understood that panic made people unpredictable. Better to create uncertainty that paralyzed decision-making while maintaining the illusion of possible survival. His initial contact techniques were psychologically sophisticated. Israel would approach victims with legitimate-seeming requests, asking for directions, requesting help with a mechanical problem, creating scenarios where refusing to help would seem antisocial. The psychology of his victim interactions involved careful escalation of control. Israel would gradually increase the level of threat while simultaneously offering hope of survival through cooperation. This technique prevented panic while ensuring compliance. He studied the psychology of shock and how it affected cognitive function. Israel understood that sudden reversal from normal interaction to life-threatening situation created temporary mental paralysis that he could exploit for initial control. Israel's control techniques were based on psychological manipulation rather than physical force. He used voice modulation to project authority, specific phrasing that suggested knowledge of the victim's family, implications that cooperation might lead to survival. His victim psychology included understanding of Stockholm Syndrome dynamics. Israel would alternate between threat and kindness, creating psychological confusion that made victims more likely to comply with his demands while hoping for mercy. The geographical psychology of his victim selection was equally sophisticated. Israel chose victims in locations where their disappearance would strain local investigation resources, small communities with limited law enforcement capabilities. He avoided victims whose disappearance would trigger federal involvement. No children, no government employees, no people whose cases would automatically escalate to higher investigative levels. Israel operated below federal radar. Israel's timing psychology involved selecting victims during periods when their absence would be initially unremarkable. People leaving for vacation, students going home for breaks, workers between jobs, natural transition periods that explained absence. His victim disposal psychology was designed to create maximum investigative confusion. Bodies placed in locations that suggested different perpetrators. Evidence scattered across multiple jurisdictions. Crime scenes that pointed to local rather than traveling killers. The psychological aspect of his victim photography was purely operational. Israel documented crime scenes not for personal gratification but for technique analysis, studying what worked, what created unnecessary risk, how to improve efficiency. Israel's victim selection included psychological assessment of family dynamics, people whose families were dysfunctional or distant, people whose disappearance might be attributed to family conflict rather than criminal activity, people who wouldn't be missed immediately. His understanding of victim psychology included knowledge of how trauma affected memory. Israel knew that surviving witnesses would have difficulty providing accurate descriptions. Shock distorted perception. Fear affected recall. Trauma created unreliable testimony. The most disturbing aspect of Israel's victim psychology was his complete emotional detachment. He didn't see victims as people. They were operational challenges, problems to be solved, objects that served his psychological needs for control and accomplishment. Israel's victim selection methodology included extensive background research. He would follow potential victims for days or weeks, learning their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities, understanding their social connections. Each victim represented months of preparation. His psychological manipulation techniques were calibrated to each victim's personality type. Aggressive people received different treatment than submissive ones. Intelligent victims required different approaches than those who seemed less analytical. Israel customized his methods. The victim psychology that Israel exploited included understanding of how people responded to authority figures. His military bearing and confident demeanor made people more likely to comply with his initial requests. Authority was his foot in the door. Israel's victim interaction psychology included techniques for maintaining control over extended periods, how to prevent escape attempts, how to maintain psychological dominance, how to ensure compliance even when physical restraints weren't possible. His selection process included psychological assessment of how different victims would behave under extreme stress. People who would fight versus people who would freeze. People who would attempt negotiation versus people who would attempt escape. The final psychological element of Israel's victim selection was his own emotional preparation. He conditioned himself to view victims as obstacles rather than people. This psychological distance enabled him to commit horrific crimes without emotional interference. You're witnessing Israel Keyes at the absolute peak of his psychological evolution. It's 2009 to 2011. He's been killing for 2 years. His methodology is perfected. His confidence is absolute. He believes he's created the perfect system for undetectable murder. Israel's psychological state during this period was characterized by what experts call operational euphoria. Every successful crime reinforced his belief in his own superiority. He wasn't just killing people, he was proving his intellectual dominance over law enforcement. His confidence had reached dangerous levels. Israel believed he had solved the fundamental problem of serial killing: how to murder repeatedly without being caught. This psychological certainty made him increasingly bold in his operations. The peak psychological state was marked by his expanding geographical range. Israel was now operating across the entire United States, Alaska to Vermont, Texas to Washington. He was treating the country as his personal hunting ground. His psychological relationship with his crimes had evolved from planning to routine. What once required months of preparation now felt natural. Israel had internalized his methodology to the point where killing felt like any other professional skill. The most dangerous aspect of his peak psychological state was his growing sense of invincibility. Israel believed he had transcended the limitations that trapped other killers. He was operating in a different category of criminal entirely. His psychological state was characterized by complete emotional compartmentalization. Israel could commit horrific crimes, then return home and function as a loving father and partner. These weren't separate personalities. They were consciously managed psychological states. During this period, Israel's psychological relationship with his victims reached its most detached point. He no longer saw them as people at all. They were operational challenges, puzzles to be solved, problems that tested his methodology. His peak psychological state included a profound sense of intellectual superiority over law enforcement. Israel believed he understood criminal investigation better than the investigators themselves. He was playing a game where only he knew the rules. The psychological momentum of his successful crimes created a feedback loop that reinforced his behavior. Each unsolved case proved his methodology worked. Each failed investigation validated his superiority. Success was breeding more success. Israel's psychological state during this period included elaborate fantasy scenarios about his future crimes. He was planning operations years in advance, imagining how he would evade capture for decades. He saw himself as embarking on a lifelong career. His relationship with risk had evolved into something approaching addiction. Israel was no longer satisfied with simple murders. He needed increasingly complex challenges, more difficult victims, more elaborate scenarios. The psychological high required constant escalation. The peak psychological state was marked by his growing contempt for other criminals. Israel viewed traditional serial killers as amateurs. Their methods were primitive. Their psychology was simple. He was operating at a higher level entirely. His psychological confidence extended to his belief that he could outsmart any investigation. Israel studied famous unsolved cases not for inspiration, but for validation. He believed he was smarter than the killers who had evaded capture for decades. During this period, Israel's psychological state included detailed revenge fantasies against law enforcement, not violent revenge, intellectual revenge. He imagined how humiliated investigators would feel when they realized how completely he had outsmarted them. His peak psychological state was characterized by profound narcissism disguised as intellectual analysis. Israel believed he was conducting important research into criminal methodology. He saw himself as advancing the science of murder. The psychological isolation that had shaped his childhood now served his adult crimes. Israel felt no emotional connection to human society. He was an observer studying specimens, a researcher conducting experiments on human subjects. His psychological state during this period included elaborate scenarios for revealing his crimes after his death. Israel imagined the shock and awe when his true activities were discovered. He was planning his legacy as the most successful serial killer in history. The peak psychological state was marked by his complete integration of criminal identity with professional identity. Israel's crimes weren't something he did. They were who he was. Murder had become his true profession. His psychological relationship with his family during this period was marked by increasing emotional distance. Israel could maintain the facade of normal relationships, but his true psychological engagement was with his crimes, not his loved ones. The most chilling aspect of his peak psychological state was his sense of historical significance. Israel believed he was revolutionizing serial killing, that future criminals would study his methods, that he was writing the next chapter in the evolution of murder. His psychological state included detailed analysis of his own emotional responses to killing. Israel was studying his own psychology with the same detachment he applied to his victims. He was simultaneously the researcher and the subject. During this period, Israel's psychological confidence led him to take increasingly unnecessary risks, not because he was becoming careless, but because he needed more challenging scenarios to maintain his psychological high. His peak psychological state was characterized by complete moral detachment. Israel didn't rationalize his crimes or justify them. He simply existed beyond normal human moral frameworks. Right and wrong were tactical considerations, not ethical ones. The psychological momentum of his success created a sense of destiny. Israel believed he was meant to be the most successful serial killer in history, that his childhood experiences had prepared him for this role, that his crimes were inevitable. His psychological state during this period included elaborate plans for expanding his operations. Israel imagined recruiting accomplices, creating a network of killers using his methodology, franchising his approach to murder. The peak psychological state was marked by his growing belief that he was untouchable. Israel felt he had moved beyond the reach of normal law enforcement. He was operating in a space where conventional rules didn't apply. His psychological relationship with his crimes had evolved from compulsion to artistic expression. Israel saw his murders as masterpieces of planning and execution. He was creating art that only he could appreciate. The most dangerous aspect of his peak psychological state was his absolute certainty that he would never be caught. Israel believed he had achieved the impossible, the perfect crime methodology. This certainty would ultimately lead to his downfall. By 2011, Israel Keyes had reached the psychological peak of his criminal career. He was operating at maximum confidence, maximum capability, and maximum danger. But psychological peaks are precarious places. The fall was coming. You're witnessing one of the most sophisticated psychological control systems ever developed by a serial killer. Israel Keyes didn't just hide his crimes from the world. He created an elaborate architecture of mental compartmentalization that allowed him to exist as multiple people simultaneously. The foundation of Israel's control mechanism was what psychologists call cognitive compartmentalization. He had trained his mind to operate in completely separate psychological spaces. His role as father existed in one compartment. His role as killer existed in another. They never intersected. His primary control mechanism was temporal separation. Israel's crimes existed in different time periods than his normal life. When he was home, he was genuinely present as a father and partner. When he was traveling, he became someone else entirely. Time itself was his psychological barrier. The geographical control mechanism was equally sophisticated. Israel's crimes happened in different places than his normal life. Distance wasn't just physical protection from investigation. It was psychological protection from emotional contamination. His crimes existed in other worlds. His identity control mechanism involved creating completely separate personas for different aspects of his life. The loving father who coached his daughter's soccer team. The reliable handyman who helped elderly neighbors. The methodical killer who buried bodies across America. Each identity was authentic within its context. Israel's emotional control mechanism was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his psychology. He had trained himself to experience genuine emotions within each compartment. His love for his daughter was real. His care for his girlfriend was real. His detachment from his victims was equally real. The routine control mechanism was crucial to maintaining his double life. Israel established rigid patterns for his normal life that created predictability for his family. Regular work schedules, consistent family time, reliable presence. This routine made his absences for crimes seem like temporary disruptions rather than concerning patterns. His communication control mechanism involved creating different psychological vocabularies for different aspects of his life. The way he spoke to his daughter was completely different from how he spoke to victims. The way he interacted with neighbors bore no resemblance to his crime scene behavior. Israel's memory control mechanism was extraordinarily sophisticated. He could recall minute details about his crimes while simultaneously maintaining complete emotional distance from those memories. His criminal activities existed as factual information rather than emotional experiences. The stress control mechanism Israel developed allowed him to return from crimes and immediately resume normal family life. He used visualization techniques to mentally transition between roles. Physical rituals that signaled psychological shifts, breathing exercises that reset his emotional state. His behavioral control mechanism ensured that his criminal activities never influenced his normal personality. Israel monitored his own behavior constantly. He watched for signs that his criminal persona might be bleeding into his family life. He maintained strict psychological boundaries. The social control mechanism was designed to prevent anyone from noticing inconsistencies in his behavior. Israel cultivated a reputation for being quiet but reliable, helpful but not overly involved, present but not intrusive. This reputation made unusual behavior seem out of character rather than suspicious. Israel's financial control mechanism involved maintaining completely separate financial systems for his criminal activities. Cash transactions that left no paper trail, accounts in different names, legitimate income that funded his normal life, criminal funding that existed in a parallel financial universe. His technological control mechanism was years ahead of law enforcement capabilities. Israel used technology to maintain his compartmentalization. Different phones for different identities, separate email accounts, computer systems that couldn't be linked to his normal life. The planning control mechanism allowed Israel to schedule his crimes around his normal life obligations. He would plan criminal activities during legitimate travel periods, use work trips as cover for reconnaissance, coordinate his killing schedule with his family schedule. Israel's alibi control mechanism was built into his normal life patterns. His regular work created natural explanations for his absences. His relationship with his girlfriend provided witnesses to his normal behavior. His involvement in his daughter's activities created public visibility during non-crime periods. The psychological transition control mechanism was perhaps the most impressive aspect of his system. Israel had developed specific techniques for moving between his different identities, mental exercises that shifted his personality, physical behaviors that signaled role changes. His evidence control mechanism extended beyond physical evidence to psychological evidence. Israel monitored his own emotional responses to ensure his crimes weren't affecting his normal personality. He watched for signs of stress or behavioral changes that might reveal his double life. The relationship control mechanism allowed Israel to maintain genuine emotional connections with his family while simultaneously planning to kill strangers. He had learned to love compartmentally. His emotions existed in separate psychological spaces that never interfered with each other. Israel's sleep control mechanism involved techniques for managing the psychological aftermath of his crimes. Visualization exercises that processed violent images, breathing techniques that prevented nightmares, mental routines that allowed him to sleep peacefully after committing murder. His social interaction control mechanism was designed to prevent anyone from detecting his true nature. Israel had studied normal social behavior so thoroughly that he could mimic it perfectly. His interactions with neighbors, coworkers, and family members were psychologically indistinguishable from those of a normal person. The professional control mechanism allowed Israel to maintain his work performance while simultaneously planning and executing murders. His handyman business never suffered. His customer relationships remained positive. His professional reputation was impeccable. Israel's parenting control mechanism was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his psychology. He could be a genuinely loving, attentive father while simultaneously planning to kill other people's children. His parental instincts existed in complete isolation from his predatory instincts. The emergency control mechanism was Israel's plan for maintaining his cover if his criminal activities were discovered. He had prepared explanations for suspicious behavior, stories that would account for his travels, psychological strategies for maintaining his innocence even under interrogation. His long-term control mechanism involved planning how to maintain his double life for decades. Israel believed he could continue killing while simultaneously being a model father and community member. He was planning a lifetime of perfect compartmentalization. The most chilling aspect of Israel's control mechanism was its sustainability. This wasn't a temporary psychological state. It was a permanent restructuring of his personality. He had created a system that could theoretically last forever. Israel's control mechanisms were so sophisticated that he began to believe they were unbreakable. He thought he had solved the fundamental problem of serial killing: how to murder repeatedly while maintaining a normal life. This confidence would ultimately contribute to his downfall. The psychological architecture Israel had built was unprecedented in criminal history. He had created a system for being multiple people simultaneously, for loving and killing with equal authenticity, for existing in separate psychological universes that never intersected. But every control system has weaknesses. Every compartmentalization has cracks. Every psychological barrier can be breached. Israel's perfect system was about to face its first real test. The control mechanisms that had served him so well were about to become the very things that would destroy him. Perfect systems are brittle. When they fail completely. You're witnessing the beginning of Israel Key's psychological unraveling. It's 2011. He's been killing successfully for years. His methodology is perfect. His control mechanisms are flawless. But something is changing. The very success that built his confidence is now creating new psychological pressures. The first pressure point was psychological tolerance. Like a drug addict needing higher doses, Israel required increasingly complex challenges to achieve the same psychological satisfaction. Simple murders were no longer enough. He needed more elaborate scenarios, more dangerous situations, more risk. His escalation began with victim selection. Israel started targeting people who were slightly more connected to their communities. not enough to trigger major investigations, but enough to create additional psychological stimulation. The increased difficulty was feeding his need for challenge. The geographical escalation was equally telling. Israel began operating closer to major population centers, not in his hometown, but in areas with more sophisticated law enforcement. The additional risk wasn't carelessness, it was psychological necessity. His technological escalation revealed growing overconfidence. Israel started using digital tools more frequently. Cell phones kept for longer periods. Credit card transactions in areas where he'd committed crimes. The very technologies he'd avoided were becoming necessary for his psychological satisfaction. The most dangerous escalation was temporal. Israel began shortening the time between crimes. His original methodology required years of patience between murders. Now he was killing multiple times per year. The psychological pressure for stimulation was overwhelming his tactical discipline. His escalation included more elaborate crime scenes. Israel began taking additional risks to create more psychologically satisfying scenarios. Extended periods with victims, more complex disposal methods, more elaborate psychological games. Each crime needed to be more stimulating than the last. The pressure point of routine was becoming problematic. Israel's normal life was beginning to feel psychologically insufficient. His role as father and partner was losing its ability to provide emotional satisfaction. His criminal identity was becoming his primary psychological reality. His escalation included increased photography and documentation. Israel began taking more risks to create records of his crimes, not for sexual gratification, but for psychological analysis. He was studying his own work with increasing obsession. The financial pressure point was creating new risks. Israel's crimes were becoming more expensive to execute. More travel, more equipment, more elaborate preparations. The financial requirements were forcing him to take shortcuts that compromised his methodology. His escalation included targeting victims during daylight hours. Israel's original methodology emphasized nighttime operations. Now he was committing crimes during periods of higher visibility. The psychological stimulation was worth the additional risk. The pressure point of secrecy was becoming psychologically burdensome. Israel had no one to share his accomplishments with, no one who could appreciate his intellectual achievements. The isolation of his success was creating a new form of psychological pressure. His escalation included more violent crime scenes. Israel began inflicting additional trauma on victims beyond what was necessary for murder, not from sadistic pleasure, but from psychological need for escalation. Each crime needed to be more extreme than the last. The pressure point of family relationships was creating internal conflict. Israel's daughter was getting older, more observant, more curious about his absences. The psychological energy required to maintain his facade was increasing while his patience for normal life was decreasing. His escalation included operating in areas with better surveillance technology. Israel began taking risks in locations with more cameras, more digital tracking, more sophisticated law enforcement. The challenge was becoming more important than the safety. The pressure point of law enforcement evolution was creating new stresses. Police techniques were improving. Forensic science was advancing. Digital tracking was becoming more sophisticated. Israel needed to escalate his methods to stay ahead of improving investigation capabilities. His escalation included longer crime sequences. Israel began spending more time with victims, creating more elaborate psychological scenarios, taking more risks for extended periods. The psychological satisfaction required more intensive experiences. The pressure point of aging was affecting his psychological state. Israel was approaching his mid-30s. His physical capabilities were at their peak, but his psychological needs were escalating beyond what his methodology could safely provide. His escalation included more public locations for crimes. Israel began targeting victims in areas where discovery was more likely, not from carelessness, but from psychological need for increased challenge. The additional risk was feeding his psychological requirements. The pressure point of success was creating unexpected psychological burdens. Israel's perfect track record was becoming a source of pressure rather than satisfaction. Each new crime needed to maintain his perfect success rate while providing escalating psychological stimulation. His escalation included more elaborate deception techniques. Israel began creating more complex false identities, more sophisticated cover stories, more elaborate alibis. The psychological energy required for deception was increasing exponentially. The pressure point of technology was forcing rapid adaptation. Israel needed to constantly update his methods to stay ahead of improving surveillance and investigation techniques. The psychological energy required for constant evolution was becoming exhausting. His escalation included targeting victims with more complex social connections. Israel began selecting people whose disappearance would create more investigative challenges, not from necessity, but from psychological need for increased difficulty. The pressure point of isolation was creating new psychological stresses. Israel's compartmentalization was becoming more difficult to maintain. The psychological energy required to keep his identity separate was increasing, while his patience for normal life was decreasing. His escalation included more elaborate disposal methods. Israel began using techniques that required more time and risk, but created more psychological satisfaction. The intellectual challenge was becoming more important than operational safety. The pressure point of perfectionism was creating impossible standards. Israel's need for flawless execution was requiring increasingly elaborate preparations. The psychological pressure to maintain his perfect record was forcing him to take greater risks. His escalation included operating closer to his home base. Israel began committing crimes in areas that were geographically closer to his normal life. The psychological pressure for stimulation was overwhelming his tactical discipline about geographical separation. The pressure point of routine was making normal life feel psychologically insufficient. Israel's daily activities were becoming emotionally flat. His criminal activities were the only aspects of his life that provided genuine psychological engagement. His escalation included more frequent travel for reconnaissance. Israel was spending more time away from his family to plan increasingly elaborate crimes. The psychological requirements of his criminal activities were consuming more of his life energy. The pressure points were converging into a perfect storm of psychological instability. Israel's perfect methodology was becoming the source of his psychological problems. His success was creating pressures that his original system couldn't handle. The escalation was accelerating beyond his control. You're inside Israel Key's mind as the first cracks appear in his perfect system. It's February 2012. The Samantha Koenig case is generating more attention than he expected. For the first time in his criminal career, Israel is experiencing something he's never felt before: genuine concern about being caught. The psychological shift began with media coverage of the Koenig disappearance. Israel had planned for routine local investigation. Instead, he was watching national news coverage. The psychological reality of his situation was different from his projections. His calculations had been wrong. His initial response to increased attention was analytical rather than emotional. Israel began studying the investigation like he studied everything else. Who were the investigators? What were their methods? What evidence did they have? This wasn't panic. This was professional assessment. The psychological pressure of investigation created a new form of stress that Israel had never experienced. He had prepared for direct confrontation with law enforcement. He hadn't prepared for the psychological burden of being hunted while maintaining his normal life facade. His analysis of the investigation revealed weaknesses in his methodology that he hadn't anticipated. The ATM video from the Koenig case provided investigators with physical evidence that connected him to the crime scene. His face was captured on camera. His perfect system had failed. The psychological impact of this failure was devastating to Israel's self-image. He had built his entire identity around being smarter than law enforcement. The existence of the video evidence proved that his methodology wasn't perfect. His intellectual superiority was an illusion. His response to the mounting investigation was to double down on his analytical approach. Israel began studying the investigators studying him. He researched FBI profiling techniques. He analyzed their public statements. He was trying to predict their next moves. The psychological pressure of maintaining his normal life while being investigated was extraordinary. Israel had to continue being a loving father and partner while simultaneously planning for the possibility of arrest. His compartmentalization skills were being tested beyond their limits. His analysis of the investigation timeline revealed that law enforcement was progressing faster than he had anticipated. Israel realized that his capture was no longer a remote possibility. It was becoming a probability. This realization created psychological pressure he had never experienced. The psychological impact of being hunted was affecting his relationship with his family. Israel found it increasingly difficult to maintain genuine emotional connections while simultaneously planning for a future where he might be separated from them permanently. His response to the investigation pressure was to begin planning his endgame. Israel started developing strategies for what he would do if arrested, how he would handle interrogation, what information he would reveal, what he would take to his grave. The psychological dynamic of being investigated was creating new forms of stress that Israel's control mechanisms couldn't handle. The uncertainty was more psychologically challenging than the actual crimes had been. He was losing control of his situation. His analysis of the investigation revealed that law enforcement was using techniques he hadn't anticipated. Digital forensics were more advanced than he had calculated. Surveillance technology was more sophisticated than he had planned for. His methodology was outdated. The psychological pressure of potential capture was creating internal conflicts that Israel had never experienced. His desire to protect his family was conflicting with his desire to maintain his criminal identity. These competing psychological needs were creating impossible choices. His response to the investigation was to accelerate his criminal activities. Israel committed additional crimes even as law enforcement was closing in. This wasn't rational behavior. It was psychological compulsion driven by the need to maintain his identity as an untouchable killer. The psychological impact of being profiled was particularly challenging for Israel. FBI behavioral analysts were studying him, creating psychological profiles, predicting his behavior. The hunter was becoming the hunted in the most intimate way possible. His analysis of the investigation revealed that law enforcement was sharing information between jurisdictions in ways he hadn't anticipated. Cases from different states were being connected. His geographical separation strategy was failing. The psychological pressure of the investigation was affecting his ability to maintain his normal persona. Family members were beginning to notice changes in his behavior. His stress was becoming visible despite his efforts to maintain compartmentalization. His response to mounting pressure was to begin destroying evidence. Israel started eliminating physical traces of his crimes, but this process was psychologically devastating. He was destroying the proof of his accomplishments. His legacy was being erased. The psychological impact of the investigation was creating a new relationship with time. Israel's perfect patience was being replaced by urgency. He was making decisions based on immediate pressure rather than long-term planning. His greatest strength was becoming his weakness. His analysis of the investigation revealed that law enforcement was closer to identifying him than he had realized. The net was tightening. His options were diminishing. His psychological preparation for capture was becoming more urgent than his criminal planning. The psychological pressure of investigation was creating internal conflicts about his family's future. Israel was beginning to understand that his criminal activities would eventually destroy the normal life he had worked so hard to maintain and protect. His response to the mounting investigation was to begin planning his final crimes. Israel was considering operations that would serve as his criminal legacy. If he was going to be caught, he wanted to ensure that his final acts would be remembered. The psychological impact of investigation was affecting his relationship with his criminal identity. Israel was beginning to question whether his perfect methodology had ever been as perfect as he believed. His intellectual superiority was being challenged by reality. His analysis of the investigation timeline revealed that his capture was imminent. Israel realized that his decades-long criminal career was about to end. This realization created psychological pressure that his control mechanisms couldn't manage. The psychological pressure of being hunted was creating new forms of stress that Israel had never experienced. He was losing sleep, making mistakes, showing signs of pressure that contradicted his carefully maintained facade. His response to the investigation was to begin planning his interrogation strategy. Israel was preparing for psychological warfare with law enforcement. He was planning to control the narrative even after his capture. The psychological impact of impending capture was creating internal conflicts about his legacy. Israel wanted to be remembered as the most successful serial killer in history, but his capture would prove that his methodology wasn't perfect. His analysis of the investigation revealed that law enforcement had evidence he didn't know existed. Israel's perfect knowledge of his crimes was incomplete. His control of the situation was an illusion. The psychological pressure of investigation was forcing Israel to confront the reality that his perfect system had failed. His intellectual superiority was a myth. His untouchable status was about to end. The investigation was destroying his fundamental sense of self. You're watching Israel Key's psychological world collapse in real time. March 13th, 2012, Lufkin, Texas. He's sitting in a rental car when law enforcement surrounds him. For the first time in his adult life, Israel is not in control. The psychological impact is immediate and devastating. The moment of capture created a psychological shock that Israel had never experienced. Despite all his planning, despite all his preparation, the reality of being arrested was fundamentally different from his theoretical scenarios. His mind was struggling to process this new reality. His first psychological response was analytical assessment. Even as handcuffs were being placed on his wrists, Israel was studying the law enforcement officers, how many agents, what agencies were represented, what evidence they might have. His analytical mind was still functioning, but beneath the analytical surface, something unprecedented was happening. Israel's carefully constructed psychological compartments were beginning to collapse. The barrier between his criminal identity and his normal identity was dissolving under the pressure of his new reality. The psychological impact of being processed like a common criminal was devastating to Israel's self-image. Fingerprints, mugshots, strip searches. The routine humiliation of arrest was destroying his sense of intellectual superiority. He was just another suspect. His initial interrogation strategy was based on his belief that he could outmaneuver law enforcement psychologically. Israel planned to control the narrative, to reveal only what he chose to reveal, to maintain his intellectual dominance even in custody. But the psychological reality of interrogation was different from his projections. The isolation of the interview room, the constant pressure of questioning, the knowledge that his every word was being analyzed. Israel was experiencing psychological stress he had never encountered. His first psychological breakdown occurred when he realized that law enforcement knew more about his crimes than he had anticipated. They had evidence he didn't know existed. His perfect knowledge of his own operations was incomplete. His control was an illusion. The psychological impact of being separated from his family was immediately apparent. Israel's compartmentalization had allowed him to be a loving father while simultaneously being a serial killer. Now those compartments were colliding in ways that created unbearable psychological pressure. His response to this pressure was to begin bargaining with investigators. Israel offered information about his crimes in exchange for guarantees about his family's treatment. His psychological priorities were shifting from self-preservation to family protection. The psychological breakdown accelerated when Israel realized that his perfect methodology had failed completely. The ATM video, the rental car records, the cell phone data, every precaution he had taken had been insufficient. His intellectual superiority was a myth. His interrogation behavior revealed the depth of his psychological collapse. Israel began providing information about crimes that investigators didn't even know about. He was confessing to murders that law enforcement hadn't connected to him. The psychological need to maintain his criminal identity was overwhelming his tactical sense. The psychological impact of media coverage was particularly devastating. Israel was watching himself being described as a serial killer on national television. His carefully maintained normal identity was being destroyed in public. His family was learning about his true nature from news reports. His response to this exposure was to attempt to control his narrative through the interrogation process. Israel began providing elaborate details about his crimes. He was trying to ensure that his intellectual sophistication would be recognized and remembered. The psychological pressure of knowing that his family was being questioned was unbearable. Israel's greatest fear wasn't his own prosecution. It was the impact of his crimes on his daughter's future. His psychological breakdown was accelerating as he contemplated the damage he had caused. His confession behavior revealed fundamental changes in his psychological state. Israel was no longer the methodical planner who had evaded capture for years. He was becoming increasingly erratic, more emotional, more human. The psychological barriers he had built were crumbling. The psychological impact of his jail cell was immediate and severe. Israel had never experienced true confinement. His entire adult life had been about freedom of movement. The physical limitation was creating psychological claustrophobia that he couldn't manage. His response to confinement was to begin planning his final act of control. Israel started contemplating suicide as a way to maintain some psychological dominance over his situation. Death would be his final expression of autonomy. The psychological breakdown was evident in his increasingly erratic behavior. Israel was alternating between cooperative confession and stubborn silence. His emotional regulation was failing. The psychological discipline of decades was dissolving. His relationship with his legal representation revealed the depth of his psychological collapse. Israel wasn't interested in mounting a defense. He was focused on controlling his narrative, on ensuring that his crimes would be remembered as intellectually sophisticated rather than simply brutal. The psychological impact of his family's rejection was devastating. Israel learned that his girlfriend had taken their daughter and disappeared. His normal identity was being erased as completely as his criminal identity was being exposed. His response to this abandonment was to accelerate his confession process. Israel began providing information about crimes across multiple states. He was trying to ensure that his criminal legacy would be complete and accurate. The psychological pressure of facing life in prison was creating new forms of stress that Israel couldn't manage. He had planned for capture, but not for the psychological reality of permanent confinement. His mind was struggling to process a future without freedom. His behavior during this period revealed the complete breakdown of his psychological control mechanisms. Israel was crying during interrogations, expressing genuine emotion about his victims, showing human responses that he had suppressed for decades. The psychological impact of his confession was complex. Israel was simultaneously relieved to reveal his true self and devastated by the destruction of his normal identity. The psychological burden of his double life was lifting, but the cost was everything he had claimed to value. His response to the investigation of his crimes was to become increasingly cooperative. Israel was helping law enforcement understand his methodology. He was teaching them how he had evaded capture for so long. The teacher was revealing his curriculum. The psychological breakdown was accelerating as Israel realized that his capture would prevent him from committing the crimes he had planned. His future operations would never be executed. His criminal career was ending incomplete. His mental state during this period was characterized by increasing desperation. Israel was losing control of his narrative. His story was being written by others. His psychological identity was being defined by people who couldn't understand his intellectual sophistication. The psychological impact of facing the death penalty was creating new pressures that Israel couldn't handle. He had planned for many contingencies, but not for the psychological reality of state-sanctioned execution. His control over his own death was being taken away. His final psychological breakdown occurred when he realized that his crimes would be remembered as failures rather than successes. His perfect methodology had failed. His intellectual superiority was a myth. His criminal career was ending in capture and humiliation rather than triumph and mystery. You're witnessing Israel Keyes navigate the legal system with the same analytical mind that planned his crimes. But now that intelligence is turned toward a different purpose, controlling how his story ends. The courtroom has become his final theater of operations. Israel's psychological approach to the legal system was fundamentally different from typical defendants. He wasn't fighting for acquittal. He wasn't claiming innocence. He was negotiating the terms of his legacy. The legal process was his last opportunity to control his narrative. His relationship with his defense attorneys revealed the depth of his psychological complexity. Israel wasn't interested in traditional legal defense strategies. He wanted lawyers who would help him tell his story accurately, rather than lawyers who would try to save his life. The psychological impact of formal charges was immediate and revealing. Israel was facing federal kidnapping charges that carried the death penalty, but his primary concern wasn't his own survival. It was ensuring that his crimes would be properly understood and documented. His behavior during legal proceedings showed remarkable psychological control. Despite his earlier breakdown, Israel was calm, articulate, and analytical. He was treating the courtroom like another operational environment that he could learn to navigate and potentially control. The psychological dynamic between Israel and prosecutors was particularly complex. They needed his cooperation to solve multiple murders across the country. He needed their platform to ensure his crimes were properly documented. This created a unique form of psychological leverage. His plea negotiation strategy revealed his psychological priorities. Israel was willing to accept life in prison if it meant his family would be protected from media attention. His bargaining position was based on emotional concerns rather than legal ones. The psychological impact of media coverage during legal proceedings was significant. Israel was watching his story being told by others. His carefully constructed identity was being interpreted by people who couldn't understand his psychological complexity. His response to legal representation was to become increasingly controlling. Israel wanted to dictate how his case was handled. He was trying to maintain the same level of operational control in the courtroom that he had maintained during his crimes. The psychological pressure of formal interrogation within the legal system was different from his earlier FBI interviews. Now everything was being recorded for potential trial use. Israel's words would become part of the official record of his crimes. His behavior during depositions revealed his psychological need to be seen as intellectually sophisticated. Israel provided elaborate details about his methodology. He was teaching law enforcement about criminal techniques while simultaneously building his legacy. The psychological impact of facing the death penalty was complex. Israel wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of being remembered as a common criminal rather than as someone who had revolutionized serial killing methodology. His relationship with prosecutors was characterized by psychological gamesmanship. Israel would provide information about some crimes while withholding details about others. He was using his knowledge as leverage to maintain some form of control. The psychological dynamic of victim impact statements was particularly challenging. Israel was forced to confront the human consequences of his crimes in ways that his compartmentalization had previously prevented. Real people describing real pain caused by his actions. His response to victim families was psychologically revealing. Israel showed genuine remorse for the pain he had caused, but not for the crimes themselves. He regretted the collateral damage, but not the primary actions. The psychological impact of solitary confinement was affecting his mental state in ways that surprised him. Israel had always been comfortable with isolation, but forced isolation was different from chosen isolation. His psychological autonomy was being systematically removed. His behavior during court appearances showed his attempt to maintain dignity despite his circumstances. Israel dressed carefully, spoke clearly, maintained eye contact. He was trying to project intellectual competence even in shackles. The psychological pressure of having his life story dissected by legal experts was intense. Israel was watching strangers analyze his psychology. His most private thoughts were becoming public record. His inner world was being exposed and interpreted. His response to psychological evaluation was to attempt to control how he was assessed. Israel tried to present himself as a complex case study rather than a simple criminal. He wanted to be remembered as psychologically fascinating rather than just dangerous. The psychological impact of his confession process was revealing internal conflicts. Israel was simultaneously proud of his criminal accomplishments and devastated by their impact on his family. These competing emotions were creating unbearable psychological pressure. His behavior during plea negotiations revealed his psychological priorities. Israel was more concerned with how his crimes would be documented than with the severity of his punishment. His legacy was more important than his life. The psychological dynamic between Israel and the judge was particularly interesting. He showed respect for the authority of the court while simultaneously trying to maintain his own intellectual authority. He was acknowledging the system while trying to transcend it. His response to legal deadlines was to accelerate his confession process. Israel realized that his time to control his narrative was limited. He began providing information about crimes across multiple states, racing against the legal timeline. The psychological impact of knowing that his case would be studied by law enforcement was significant. Israel was contributing to the very system that had captured him. His methodology would be analyzed to prevent future crimes like his. His behavior during final legal proceedings showed acceptance of his fate combined with determination to control his ending. Israel wasn't fighting the legal system. He was using it as a platform to ensure his story would be told accurately. The psychological pressure of media attention during legal proceedings was affecting his family in ways that devastated him. Israel's greatest fear was being realized. His crimes were destroying the people he claimed to love. His response to sentencing recommendations was to focus on the protection of his family rather than his own fate. Israel was more concerned with ensuring his daughter's anonymity than with avoiding the death penalty. The psychological impact of formal sentencing would have been the final test of his mental state. Israel was preparing to hear his fate pronounced by the state. His life would be formally ended by legal decree rather than by his own choice. His planned response to sentencing was to maintain the same analytical demeanor he had shown throughout the legal process. Israel wanted to be remembered as someone who faced his consequences with intellectual dignity rather than emotional breakdown. The psychological reality of spending life in prison was creating new forms of pressure that Israel couldn't manage. He had planned for capture, but not for the psychological reality of permanent confinement without any possibility of freedom or control. You're standing at the end of one of the most psychologically complex criminal cases in American history. Israel Keyes died by suicide in his cell on December 2, 2012. But his psychological legacy lives on, fundamentally changing how we understand serial killing, criminal investigation, and the prevention of future predators. The psychological impact of Israel's suicide was his final act of control. He had planned this ending from the moment of his capture. Death was his ultimate expression of autonomy, his final victory over a system that had stripped away every other form of control. His suicide note revealed the depth of his psychological complexity. Israel expressed genuine remorse for the pain his crimes caused his family, but not for the crimes themselves. He regretted the collateral damage while maintaining pride in his criminal accomplishments. The psychological legacy of Israel Keyes forced law enforcement to completely reconceptualize serial killer profiling. His methodology broke every established pattern. He didn't have a victim type. He didn't hunt in familiar territory. He didn't leave signatures. Traditional profiling was useless. His case created new psychological frameworks for understanding modern serial killers. Israel proved that high intelligence combined with methodical planning could create predators who operated beyond traditional detection methods. The textbooks had to be rewritten. The psychological impact on investigators was profound. FBI agents who had worked hundreds of cases described Israel as fundamentally different from other serial killers. His intellectual approach to murder created new categories of criminal psychology. His methodology influenced changes in law enforcement training. Police academies began teaching about geographically dispersed serial killers, about predators who used modern technology and transportation to evade detection, about criminals who planned decades in advance. The psychological legacy extends to victim advocacy programs. Israel's case highlighted the vulnerability of isolated individuals. His victim selection criteria created new awareness about who was at risk and how communities could better protect their most vulnerable members. His case influenced changes in missing person investigations. Law enforcement agencies began sharing information more systematically across jurisdictions. The geographical barriers that Israel exploited were being systematically removed. The psychological impact on criminal psychology research was immediate and lasting. Israel became a case study in graduate programs across the country. His methodology was analyzed to understand how future predators might evolve. His legacy influenced changes in technology use by law enforcement. The tools that Israel used to evade detection became the same tools that investigators learned to use for tracking. His case accelerated the adoption of digital forensics techniques. The psychological impact on families of victims was complex. Israel's suicide prevented them from confronting him in court. His death denied them the opportunity for closure through the legal process. His final act of control extended to denying justice to his victims' families. His case created new psychological frameworks for understanding compartmentalization. Israel's ability to be a loving father while simultaneously being a serial killer challenged fundamental assumptions about human psychology and moral capacity. The psychological legacy influenced changes in community safety programs. Neighborhoods began implementing better communication systems. Elderly residents received more regular check-ins. The vulnerabilities that Israel exploited were being systematically addressed. His methodology influenced changes in forensic science priorities. Law enforcement agencies began investing more heavily in technologies that could track geographically dispersed crimes. The tools needed to catch future Israel keys were being developed. The psychological impact on his family was devastating and permanent. His daughter would grow up knowing her father was one of America's most notorious serial killers. His girlfriend would spend years recovering from the psychological trauma of discovering his true nature. His case influenced changes in military psychological screening. The military began implementing better assessment tools for identifying soldiers who might use their training for criminal purposes. Israel's case highlighted the potential dangers of training individuals in violence without adequate psychological evaluation. The psychological legacy extends to academic research. Israel's case became a foundation for understanding how childhood isolation and religious extremism can combine with high intelligence to create extraordinarily dangerous individuals. His methodology influenced changes in rental car and hotel industry security. Companies began implementing better tracking systems. The anonymous cash transactions that Israel relied on became more difficult to execute. The psychological impact on criminal justice policy was significant. Israel's case contributed to discussions about life imprisonment versus the death penalty. His suicide prevented the state from executing him, raising questions about the effectiveness of capital punishment as a deterrent. His case created new psychological frameworks for understanding criminal evolution. Israel represented the next generation of serial killers, predators who understood modern technology and used it to their advantage rather than being trapped by it. The psychological legacy influenced changes in community policing strategies. Law enforcement agencies began focusing more attention on transient individuals. The anonymous handymen and contractors who had provided Israel with perfect cover became subjects of greater scrutiny. His methodology influenced changes in federal law enforcement coordination. The FBI created new protocols for sharing information about potentially connected crimes across vast geographical areas. The system that Israel exploited was being systematically repaired. The psychological impact on public safety awareness was immediate. Communities began implementing better communication systems. Neighbors started paying more attention to temporary workers and transient individuals. The social trust that Israel exploited was being balanced with appropriate caution. His case influenced changes in psychological evaluation of criminals. Israel's case became a template for understanding how traditional assessment tools might miss highly intelligent, methodical predators. New evaluation techniques were developed specifically for complex cases. The psychological legacy extends to prevention programs. Israel's case highlighted the importance of early intervention in children who show signs of extreme compartmentalization and emotional detachment. His psychological development became a roadmap for identifying future risks. His methodology influenced changes in evidence preservation and analysis. Law enforcement agencies began maintaining better records of unsolved cases. The cold cases that Israel might have been responsible for were being systematically re-examined. The psychological impact on criminal justice education was profound. Law schools began teaching about the Israel Keys case as an example of how traditional legal frameworks might be inadequate for dealing with highly sophisticated criminals. His case created new psychological frameworks for understanding criminal motivation. Israel wasn't driven by traditional factors like rage, sexual compulsion, or financial gain. His motivation was intellectual satisfaction and the psychological challenge of committing perfect crimes. The psychological legacy of Israel Keys will continue to influence how we understand criminal psychology for decades to come. His case proved that our assumptions about serial killers were incomplete, that our detection methods were inadequate, that our prevention strategies needed fundamental revision. The most important psychological legacy is the understanding that monsters aren't always obviously monstrous, that the most dangerous predators can be loving fathers and helpful neighbors, that evil can wear the mask of normalcy so convincingly that it becomes virtually undetectable until it's too late.